Welcome to my channel. I am Ben. Today, we step into a haunting case of a first date turned into tragedy. A summer night under the full moon, where laughter gave way to gunfire, and only one voice was left to tell what really happened. Late summer air hung thin over a mountain reservoir. The moon was full bright enough to silver the water and bleach the canyon's edges into hard lines. On the two-lane road, headlights cut through dust and insects, a quiet procession of locals heading home. Nothing about the night suggested violence. Yet the first sign was movement, where there should have been none. A figure climbing out of brush, staggering, hands lifted into the light, clothes soaked, face streaked. A voice, hoarse, asking for help. Then the catch in the lungs that comes after running from death. Drivers eased to the shoulder, doors cracked open, fear spilled out with the dome lights. Somewhere below, the black mouth of a trail dropped toward the shoreline. The wind smelled like sap and hot brakes. The woman tried to speak in whole sentences. Shock chopped them into pieces. She and a friend had been on the path. There was a stranger. There was a gun. The night had erupted, then gone quiet again. Too quiet for anyone who has just heard shots in a canyon. Caution took over. No one wanted to descend into darkness if a shooter could still be waiting. Someone dialed for help. Someone else scanned the slope with a flashlight, the beam shivering over rock and scrub. In that beam lay the outlines of a scene that made no sense for a date night. A scattered tripod leg, a camera bag yawning on its side, glints that might have been pebbles until they resolved into glass. Farther down, indistinct but unmistakable, the stillness that separates injury from death. Sirens never sound close in the mountains, they arrive in waves. First rumor, then reality. When they did, uniforms stepped into the pool of moonlight and began the ritual. Secure, assess, mark, preserve. A beautiful night had become a crime scene, and beauty, indifferent as ever, kept shining on the water as if to deny what the ground already knew. The only certainty was this: the violence started fast, at close range, and without warning. The only question, the one that would drive every lead and every interview, was why it started at all. Cliffhanger. The trail down the embankment held the answer to who was missing, and the first clue to who had fired beneath the full moon. Before the gunfire and the headlines, Zach Snarr and Yvette Rodier were just two young people at the edge of adulthood. Both were 18 years old in the summer of 1996, and both were discovering the rhythms of independence. Late nights, shared jokes, and the quiet thrill of friendships turning into something more. Their story began in the hallways of high school, where Zach's quick wit made him impossible to ignore. He was the boy who always had a remark ready, playful enough to make Yvette roll her eyes, but sharp enough to make her smile. Over time, that banter became its own kind of language, and with it came the sense that something deeper might be waiting. Zach was known for his laugh, big and infectious, and for his passion for photography. Friends remember him as someone who could find beauty in the ordinary. He carried a camera with him, often black and white film, because he believed those tones captured truth more honestly than color. He was preparing to study photography seriously, hoping to carve out a career behind the lens. He was also the kind of friend people leaned on. Steady, curious, sometimes sarcastic, but always kind. His family described him as larger than life, not because he was loud, but because his presence filled a room. Yvette, by contrast, carried a quieter energy, bright, thoughtful, and with a resilience she did not yet know she possessed. She was a loyal friend and an attentive student. She hadn't planned to fall for Zach after all. They had known each other so long as classmates That romance seemed improbable, yet the spark was there, undeniable. On the night of August 28th, when Zach finally asked her out, she felt a flutter of surprise mixed with anticipation. She even teased herself with the thought, maybe tonight he would kiss her. That first date wasn't supposed to be grand. It was meant to be simple, genuine, and reflective of who Zach was. He picked her up, drove her into the canyon, and unveiled his surprise, a chance to photograph the full moon. He set out his camera gear with the eagerness of someone sharing what he loved most. For Yvette, the gesture meant more than flowers or dinner. It was intimacy, an opening into his world, and a sign that he saw her as more than just a friend. The canyon was their stage, concrete paths leading towards still water, the hum of crickets, and the glow of a moon that seemed to spotlight them. It was, in every way, the start of something, the beginning of a memory that should have belonged to them alone. But memory, for Yvette, would become something else entirely. Instead of capturing the moon, the night would be captured in bullets, trauma, and a single haunting truth. This was Zach's first and last date. His life, so full of promise, would be reduced to photographs others kept after he was gone. The reservoir was quiet when Zach parked his Ford Bronco that night. The concrete path stretched ahead of them, leading down towards still water that reflected the glow of a swollen full moon. Zach carried his tripod and camera bag with a grin that suggested this would be fun, a lesson as much as a date. Yvette followed, caught in the small thrill of being alone with him, in a place that felt carved out of time. The night was theirs. Then came headlights. A white truck rolled into the parking area. Nothing unusual. In Utah's canyons, cars often paused at 8:30 or 9, their drivers seeking a view or a smoke. Yvette barely noticed, until a man stepped out and approached. He asked where the path went, his tone casual. She answered politely, turning slightly to glance at Zach. It was a gesture so ordinary, so small, that she could not have known it was her last moment of innocence. The man pulled a gun. Without warning, he opened fire. Bullets cracked the quiet, slamming into flesh and stone. The air filled with acrid smoke and the metallic snap of shell casings hitting pavement. Yvette screamed as pain tore through her side and shoulder. She fell, disoriented, her ears ringing. Zach collapsed beside her. In seconds, their world dissolved into chaos. Silence followed. Then the sound of metal, the stranger reloading, the rhythm of cartridges sliding into a chamber carried a meaning clearer than words. He wasn't finished. More shots exploded, the force of them so close that Yvette could feel the air whip past her face. She lay motionless, remembering advice her father once gave about grizzlies. Play dead. She willed her breath shallow. Eyes open, body slack. The shooter bent over her, close enough for his breath to touch her skin. He rifled her pockets, searching for money. Terror surged, not from the bullets, but from the possibility of something worse. She braced for rape. Instead, he took what he could and turned away. His footsteps faded into the dark. Moments later, Zach's Bronco roared to life, stolen, driven by the man who had just destroyed their night. The quiet that followed was unbearable. Yvette called Zach's name. No answer. She tried again. Only silence. Pain radiated from her wounds, but her arms still worked, and one leg could move. Crawling, dragging, she began climbing the steep slope back toward the road. Rocks scraped her palms. The incline felt vertical, impossible, but the thought of help pulled her forward. She fell back more than once, disoriented, but pressed on. At the roadside, headlights blurred into streaks. She waved both arms, desperate, blood streaking down her clothes. The first car did not stop. The second did. A couple stepped out, stunned at the sight before them. To them, she seemed like a figure torn from a horror movie. But the terror was real. She told them her name. She explained she and a friend had been shot. She asked for help. They hesitated to go down the trail, fearful the gunman might still be nearby. They dialed for rescue and stayed by her side, repeating promises that help was coming. When the helicopter lifted her from the canyon floor, she looked up through the gurney's straps at the sky. The paramedic, perhaps trying to distract her, remarked on the beauty of the night. And it was beautiful. That was what struck her. The same moon that had drawn Zach out for photographs now shone over carnage. She realized this might be her last sight of peace. Doctors counted at least 4 direct wounds. One bullet ripped into her shoulder, carving away flesh. Another tore into her side, expanding and blowing open her torso. A third tunneled from her back down into her thigh, lodging deep inside. A fourth grazed her head, close enough to steal hair and skin, but not consciousness. Several others grazed her skull. Survival was improbable, yet she lived. Meanwhile, Zach's family was jolted awake by detectives at their door. The knock came close to 1 in the morning. News of a shooting. Their son's involvement. Their questions spiraled into dread, until the officers confirmed what they already knew in their hearts. Zach was dead. For Yvette, waking in the hospital meant facing not only her own survival, but also the void left beside her. When Zach's parents came to see her, their first words were gratitude that she lived. Yvette, instead, felt crushing guilt. She wished she could trade places, let Zach return home instead of her. The crime had already shifted from an act of violence to a life-altering wound for 2 families. One boy, gone forever. One young woman, scarred in body and spirit. And somewhere out there, the man who had done this was driving Zach's Bronco, free for the moment, but already on a path that would lead back into the light of police sirens. The search for Zach's killer began before dawn. Detectives arriving at the scene cataloged every fragment of evidence. Casings scattered across the pavement, blood trails leading down the slope, Zach's camera bag abandoned in the dust. But the most glaring absence was his Ford Bronco. It was gone, and its theft gave investigators their first lead. Whoever had fired those shots was no phantom. He was now driving a vehicle that would stand out on the road. Within hours, the stolen Bronco was spotted. It had been driven away from the reservoir and abandoned. Nearby, police found another vehicle, a white truck left behind, registered to a 19-year-old named Jorge Benvenuto. Inside was Zach's wallet. The evidence pointed quickly and directly to a suspect. Benvenuto was a recent immigrant from Uruguay. He had lived briefly in New York before moving to Utah. Neighbors described him as quiet, withdrawn, a loner who kept to himself. He had bought a handgun just weeks earlier. That weapon now appeared to be the same one used in the canyon attack. The arrest came almost anticlimactically. After only a couple of days, a gas station attendant recognized him from news broadcasts. Benvenuto was sitting behind the station, eating cookies bought with Zach's money. When police closed in, he offered no resistance. For officers who had seen the brutality of the crime, the casual normalcy of his arrest was jarring. He looked, one recalled, like just a kid. At the police station, detectives tried to understand what had led him to pull the trigger on 2 strangers. His answers were chilling. He said he was tired of living, that he wanted to do something terrible enough to then kill himself. Shooting the couple was supposed to give him courage. But when it came time, he lost his nerve. Instead of turning the gun on himself, he had turned it again and again on them. He admitted he wanted to know what it felt like to watch someone die. Prosecutors quickly filed charges, aggravated murder for the killing of Zach Snarr, attempted murder for the shooting of Yvette Rodier, aggravated robbery for taking their belongings in car, and related firearms offenses. Each charge carried heavy penalties. The community, still reeling from the randomness of the violence, demanded the harshest possible response. For Zach's family, grief quickly hardened into resolve. They told prosecutors directly they wanted the death penalty. It was not about vengeance, they said, but about proportion. Zach's life had been stolen at random for the thrill of a stranger. The only justice, they believed, was the most severe punishment the law allowed. For Yvette, the investigation meant reliving trauma while still undergoing surgeries. Doctors pulled bullets and fragments from her body. Nurses checked wounds that would never fully heal. Through it all, she gave statements, answered questions, and steeled herself for the knowledge that she might one day have to face the man who had shot her. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no question who had pulled the trigger. The only question left was how the legal system would respond, and whether the punishment would match the crime. When Jorge Benvenuto was led into court, the air itself seemed to shift. Families of both victims filled the benches, clutching tissues, some staring daggers, others simply stunned. Yvette Rodier sat with her body still healing, bracing herself for the moment she would look into the eyes of the man who had nearly killed her and murdered her friend. For Zach's parents, the courtroom was the cruel confirmation of what they had already lost. The preliminary hearing was like a condensed trial. Witnesses testified, evidence was displayed, and for the first time, the public saw the young man accused. Benvenuto looked ordinary, almost boyish. That fact unsettled many. Evil, they realized, does not always arrive wearing a monster's mask. When asked to enter a plea, he stood and said the words, "Not guilty." For Yvette, watching him deny what she had survived was like being shot again. Later, when she was asked to identify the shooter in the room, she lifted her finger, her hand trembling, and pointed. The act of naming him publicly was terrifying, but necessary. Everyone could see the weight it placed on her. Afterward, she collapsed in sobs, drained but defiant. Prosecutors prepared for a capital murder case. The Snarr family pressed for the death penalty, and the state was ready to pursue it. They believed they had a strong case, overwhelming physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the defendant's own incriminating statements. Yet even strong cases face risks. To secure death, all 12 jurors would have to agree beyond reasonable doubt, and appeals could drag on for decades. As the process unfolded, another option emerged: a plea deal. Benvenuto would admit guilt and accept life imprisonment without parole. For the families, the decision was agonizing. Would accepting it betray Zach's memory? Would pushing for death prolong their suffering with years of appeals, media coverage, and protests from death penalty opponents? In the end, they chose finality over spectacle. They agreed to the deal. In court, the sentence was pronounced: life without the possibility of parole. For the Snarrs, it meant knowing the killer would never again walk free. For Yvette, it meant she would never again have to sit across from him in a courtroom. But the case refused to stay closed. Benvenuto later filed an appeal, claiming he had been depressed when he accepted the plea and should be allowed to withdraw it. For the families, it felt like betrayal layered on betrayal. They had given up the certainty of a death sentence for the guarantee of permanence, and now even that seemed threatened. At the appeal hearing, Yvette spoke directly to him. She turned toward the man who had haunted her and asked, "What was it like watching someone die? Was it worth it?" He looked up only briefly before lowering his head, refusing to answer. That single glance was the only acknowledgement he ever gave her. Though the appeal dragged the families back into court, the life sentence ultimately stood. The system had spoken. Jorge Benvenuto would spend the rest of his days behind bars. Understanding why Jorge Benvenuto killed is a task that stretches psychology to its limits. He was 19 years old, not yet fully formed, but already carrying a darkness that erupted into violence. Investigators and experts later described him as a loner, someone who had drifted without strong ties to family, friends, or community. Isolation can sharpen resentment. For Benvenuto, it seemed to fester into obsession. He had purchased his handgun only weeks before the crime. Some said the purchase followed a burglary at his home, an event that left him angry and paranoid. But anger at being robbed does not explain the decision to ambush strangers on a date. In interviews, he admitted motives that went far beyond revenge. He wanted to know what it felt like to kill. He wanted, in his own words, to watch someone die. This was not self-defense. This was not a crime of passion. It was curiosity twisted into cruelty, what criminologists call a thrill kill. The psychology of thrill killing is rare but terrifying. Perpetrators are often young men seeking power, control, and stimulation. They experience a rush not from money or gain, but from extinguishing life itself. For Benvenuto, the firearm became a totem. It gave him a sense of control, of superiority. After pulling the trigger, he described feeling powerful. Yet when he discovered Yvette had survived, he seemed disappointed, almost as if the weapon had betrayed him. He wanted totality, and he did not achieve it. Psychologists note that thrill killers often lack empathy to a pathological degree. They see other people not as beings with families, futures, and fears, but as objects to be used for their own experimentation. In Benvenuto's case, the randomness of his choice underscored the danger. Zach and Yvette were not enemies, not rivals, not even acquaintances. They were simply available. Survivors like Yvette often struggle with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when another died. But from a psychological perspective, the fact that she lived added a counterweight to his narrative. She became the voice he could not silence, the testimony that would define him not as powerful, but as pathetic, a boy with a gun who sought meaning in destruction. Forensic psychiatrists who studied the case suggested depression and suicidal ideation played a role. Benvenuto himself admitted he wanted to commit suicide after the act. Yet this does not lessen responsibility. Instead, it reveals a distorted logic. He sought courage for self-destruction by first destroying someone else. It is a psychology that weaponizes despair, turning inward pain outward with catastrophic effect. What remains most unsettling is how ordinary he appeared. Photos showed a young man with a boyish face, not the caricature of a killer. But behind that face was an emptiness. In the courtroom, parents of both families looked at him and saw no soul, no remorse. For them, he was a void. And perhaps that is the truest psychological portrait of Jorge Benvenuto, a young man whose emptiness demanded to be filled, and who chose to fill it with blood. After the sentencing, life did not return to normal. For the Snarr family, there was no normal left. Their son, once larger than life, was now a memory carved into headstones and photographs. Friends and classmates filled the church for his funeral, a service so crowded it spilled into aisles. Yvette attended, frail and barely able to walk, released from the hospital just long enough to say goodbye. She carried survivor's guilt heavy on her shoulders, believing she had stolen a place that should have been Zach's. In the months that followed, grief hollowed the Snarr household. Silence weighed down rooms once filled with Zach's laughter. His parents described it as discovering what a broken heart truly meant, not just sadness, but a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. They looked at neighbors continuing with their lives and wondered how anyone could smile when their own world had ended. Yvette's journey was different, but no less brutal. Her body endured 5 surgeries. Nerve damage left one side of her body with constant pain, yet it was the invisible wounds that proved hardest. She struggled with anger, fear, and a hatred for Benvenuto that she described as like a cancer spreading through my body. For a long time, she was terrified to be alone, convinced he might return to finish what he had started. But slowly, transformation came, encouraged by family and by Zach's memory. Yvette redirected her pain. She pursued law school, determined to help other victims in the justice system. She built a career offering compassion from a place of lived experience. Even if she rarely shared her own story, she married, became a mother, and though her marriage ended, she found strength in raising her daughter. For the Snarrs, Yvette became a bridge to their son. They felt bound to her, knowing she had been with Zach in his final moments, that she had seen him happy just before the shots rang out. Over time, she became family. Decades later, Yvette still thinks of Zach daily. She named her son after him. She says that every time she sees a full moon, she remembers that night, the beauty, the horror, the way life and death collided under the same light. For her, Zach remains the man in the moon, a presence she cannot look at the sky without recalling. The public remembers the case as one of the starkest examples of random violence, a reminder of how fragile ordinary joy can be. But for those who lived it, the meaning is more personal. It is about resilience, the power of memory, and the refusal to let a killer own the narrative. Every true crime story leaves us with questions, but some leave us with lessons too. The case of Zach Snarr and Yvette Rodier reminds us how fragile life can be. An ordinary summer evening, just a short drive into the Utah Canyon, turned into something that would change families forever. It shows that violence can erupt without reason, that a single night under a full moon can shift the course of countless lives. But it also shows us something deeper: the resilience of survivors and the strength of memory. Yvette endured 5 surgeries, permanent nerve damage, and years of emotional scars. Yet she chose not to let hatred define her. She became a lawyer, dedicating her career to helping victims. Zach's family carried unbearable grief, but they welcomed Yvette as part of their own lives. Together, they proved that love and memory are stronger than the cruelty of a single act. So here is the question I want to ask you. When faced with unimaginable tragedy, do you believe justice is found more in punishment or in the way survivors choose to live afterward? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. And if you found this story powerful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next case we uncover.